Hey, hi. Thank you for coming on, Derek. This is awesome. Long time coming. Um, we got so much to talk about today. But before we do, I think it might be appropriate if you introduce yourself and some of your work, maybe the research you do, and then also the new book that you got coming out.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Tyler, for having me. So my name's Derek Ide. I am from Toledo, Ohio, born and raised. I did my dissertation at the University of Houston, my PhD in history, and I was very interested in studying the intersection between Black internationalism and the Palestinian Revolution. I was that project was kind of created the sort of the idea for it during the summer of 2014. I was a master's student at the University of Toledo, and I was doing a project on Arab nationalism, Egypt in the 50s and 60s, Gamal Abdel Nasser's relationship with, say, the Egyptian communist movement. But in the summer of 2014, there were two concomitant things that occurred: the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which launched what became kind of this, at the time, was this nebulous sort of Black Lives Matter movement. And then the concomitant bombing of Gaza under Operation Protective Edge. And amidst those two sort of simultaneous events, there was a flurry of interactions between, say, activists in Palestine and activists operating here in the United States, particularly black activists who were involved with Black Lives Matter. And so I decided that I really wanted to pursue those historical legacies. So this project, this book that I have now, my dissertation turned into a book. The book is under contract with the University of California Press. It's called Ghosts of Bandung: Black Internationalism and the Palestinian Revolution During the Cold War, and it is an attempt to tell the story of these sort of historical the historical trajectory of this sort of Black internationalist solidarity with the Palestinian question, but also attempt to reverse the gaze and understand, say, how Palestinians and Palestinian parties, say, like the Popular Front, understood civil rights and Black power. And it became really a broader global Cold War story. I really couldn't tell this story without this
Yeah,
massive international kind of geopolitical setting. And so the archives, have me talking about China and Algeria and Cuba, and most importantly, Indonesia. So I spend a lot of time on something called Knefo in the book.
awesome. And how incredibly timely, considering all of this, I suppose, a new wave of anti-American imperialism in some of these parts of the world. And I feel like the referencing to Bandung and that Global South coalition, this kind of newfound front of independent countries speaking up for themselves for the first time. Uh, I do note that in the details that you sent me about the book, there is what is called the collapse of the anti-imperial. So what was it called? There's a collapse of anti-imperial infrastructure, but did we talk about some of the kind of radical ideas that are bubbling up from the surface and other things, as I see it, as we see it today with the media and youth and ideas, people questioning who they are and where they're from? I think because this show was originally concepted to discuss primarily China-Africa relations, and a huge part of that was this push that China had during the Cold War, anti-imperial messaging to newly independent nations. And the alliance is there. However, we then understand that piggybacking off of the votes, not that that was the bad thing, but piggybacking off of the votes from certain key African nations, I think 17, they're able to secure a seat in the UN. They're able to be essentially a part of the international community that they may have been fighting against. And then this happens, anticipation of this momentum. So it would be really cool to talk about all of that, which I mean, it's so broad. But I mean, I have a series of questions that I want to ask you, and I'll stay quiet for the most part. Yeah, so number one, which is, I guess, the crux of this book. what for anybody who doesn't know, what is Black internationalism?
Yeah, well, I'm certain that it will depend on who you ask, but I think a sort of rough conceptual grounding or understanding of Black internationalism would be generally the practice that many Black intellectuals, militants, and revolutionaries across sort of transhistorically across sort of the modern era, but especially in the 20th century, the way in which these thinkers and militants and revolutionaries, many times they didn't consider themselves activists, by the way. This is a very recent term that we call ourselves activist or something of this nature. But these were people who were engaged in what they viewed as a Black liberation struggle that was part and parcel of a broader global liberation struggle. So the idea of Black internationalism is sort of historically situating Black liberation within this broader context. And generally, this implied big picture questions, broader critiques of the general sort of trifecta of imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, and how these things sort of go hand in hand in the modern era. So in the 20th century, we're very lucky to sort of draw on a rich canon of Black internationalist thought. So responding to different flashpoints in history as well. So the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, these emerging anti-colonial struggles across what we call the global South, or what we used to call the Third World. So Africa, Asia, Latin America. Whether we're talking about Harry Haywood at the Comintern in 1928 articulating the Black Belt thesis, or Robert F. Williams in Beijing giving speeches alongside Mao in Tiananmen Square, or the Black Panther Party having a literal embassy of sorts in Algiers, or scholars like Gerald Horne, who have a prolific set of literature on Black internationalism in different periods. We have a very rich intellectual and political canon to draw from when we're talking about Black internationalism.
Really interesting. What you touched upon there was, especially with China, I think kind of leads into the next sub question that I have about this is just where do you find, as it is a China-Africa show, where do you find the intersection between Black internationalism and China's then anti-imperial rhetoric? Where are those intersections? And do you address that at all in the book? Knowing that, there's a lot of attention in Indonesia, and it might have been a big player in the London conference in drafting resolutions and things of that sort. I was just curious just where the intersection is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, China actually comes out as one of the big stars of Bandung, of course. So it's hosted in Indonesia. It's the sort of intellectual, the Bandung Conference, technically the Afro-Asian Solidarity Conference. We use shorthand the term Bandung, the Bandung Conference. There's Bandung 1 and then there's Bandung 2, by the way, in Algiers, planned for Algiers in the summer of 1965. That conference is actually thwarted in a coup. We could talk about that later. We'll set it aside. But when we're talking about
Yeah, yeah.
Bandung now, we'll talk about Bandung 1, which takes place in 1955 in the Indonesian city of Bandung. Of course, the Indonesians have a long history of anti-colonial struggle against the Dutch. Sukarno, the president of Indonesia, was the leader. But China is invited, the PRC is invited to participate in Bandung, and Zhou Enlai is sent. And Zhou Enlai, of course, is a major figure who deals especially with foreign policy during the years of Mao. He is a sort of towering giant. There's a recent, I don't know if I have it right here, I would show you, a recent 600 or 700 page biography of him that just recently was published. It's a fascinating read. But he does extraordinarily well at Bandung, both in terms of diplomatically engaging with a wide array of both sort of what we would call progressive, sort of nationalist governments, sort of left-leaning governments, but also even assuages and mitigate some of the fears of some of the sort of more Western-oriented countries within the Third World who are very concerned about the word communism and communists. And so Zhou Enlai actually really comes out as one of the major players of Bandung. And part of that is his ability to really expertly navigate on the diplomatic level amongst a variety of different players and places and individuals. And so when we're dealing with this notion of anti-imperialist rhetoric, China actually has multiple periods where even within the Maoist years of where there's the anti-imperial rhetoric is kind of ratcheted up or ratcheted down depending upon the moment, right? And so part of the story I tell, actually China plays a massive, towering role in the book. Part of the story I tell is the way in which throughout the 1950s, there's this sort of slow, cautious building of these linkages between the global south. We see this in the Bandung movement. And what we often do is we, at least in our sort of popular understanding, insofar as people have popular understandings of Bandung, we think of Bandung and then we immediately associate it with non-alignment. So we go from Bandung, and there's a
Yeah.
straight line from Bandung to non-alignment. And this is how many, many activists and thinkers and even academics understand Bandung. There's this thing in 55, and then it becomes non-alignment. And this is the big story, right? There's this bully, the Soviet Union, and this bully, the United States, and these global South countries can just navigate between the two, and this is non-alignment, and it all starts in Bandung. What you really find when you dig into the historical record is that Bandung is, non-alignment is really a competing separate organization meant to kind of move away from Bandung. One of the fears that emerged from Bandung is that it was actually too closely aligned with the Chinese model, and that many of the states were growingly sympathetic to this model, and in particular, as something called the Sino-Soviet split begins to really bubble under the surface, starting in 1956, with Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech where he denounces Stalin and then engages on this policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. Many states in the global South, particularly those who had been subject to European colonialism, asked themselves, well, can we really have peaceful coexistence with a place like the United States? And so the Chinese model, the PRC becomes a kind of, it inherits the legacy that the Soviets used to have of the sort of leader of the world revolution. And so the PRC becomes the sort of center of gravity for many of these young, emerging anti-colonial states who are looking for a different model than this Soviet model of peaceful coexistence. And so Bandung is an extraordinarily complicated event with all kinds of differing and competing sets of interest. But what does emerge from Bandung is this shared sense of antagonism to white supremacy and what they call racialism. In essence, this sort of manifestation of political forms of white supremacy or any kind of racism that becomes institutionalized in the states, generally often being a legacy of imperial powers. And so this becomes one point of sort of shared agreement between these various countries that come together during Bandung. And China has a big role in helping sort of hammer out and solidify many of these sort of shared, what are at the time very modest proposals, right? Apartheid in South Africa is bad. It's a racist
Yeah.
system of governance, right? And so these are very, very modest things. This is
Yeah.
not a particularly, at least by today's standards, a particularly radical set of notions. But in 1955, this was really challenging many of the dominant structures that had prevailed through the first half of the 20th century. And so it is it's a very pivotal moment in that regard. China's role is very important there. Zhou Enlai becomes a big star. And in fact, so does Gamal Abdel Nasser in the Arab world. It's his first international trip ever, other than to go to Mecca for Hajj. And he also becomes a sort of major player. But the point here is that I'd like to make, just so that the audience knows, when non-alignment is formed in Belgrade in 1961, it is a fundamentally different, moving in a different track, a different trajectory than Bandung. Bandung was meant to be Afro-Asian solidarity. That was the name of the conference, and there was this idea that there could be these geographical boundaries that bound Africa and Asia.
Mm.
And when we say Asia, we mean all the way from East Asia to West Asia, to the Middle East, the Levant, and then into North Africa, all the way down to South Africa. And they shared this colonial history that was that had ended very recently. sort of unlike in many ways the Latin American republics, which had won independence much earlier, but that this Afro-Asian world was something that existed historically for many, many years, many centuries, interacted with one another, and so insofar as that was the case, it had this sort of shared history. And out of that could be a particular set of political and economic solidarities that could emerge. Uh, the non-aligned movement is something different, and it's something actually that is really heavily sponsored by the Soviets. The Soviets are actually big proponents of non-alignment, and then also partially as a result of their closeness and their proximity to, say, Nehru in India. And China and India are going to be two sort of competing centers in the 1960s, with Nehru in India being the sort of more moderate, non-aligned kind of model, and then the PRC under Mao being the more radical kind of approach to how you win your liberation, and the model that inspires many of these global South countries to look to this victorious model that emerges in 1949 under China. So it's a big, broad question, and
Yeah.
there's a lot to talk about. So I hope it doesn't go
No,
too
no.
far off the tracks. But
Well, you touched on so many points. The last thing, did not realize that India and China, both centers of this, had different, or almost fundamentally different approaches. Um, Going back to the more popular, I suppose, anti-imperialistic rhetoric that China was spewing in Africa at that time, all around. Did you feel in the book it is addressed? Oh, no, sorry. Do you address in the book kind of the African narrative at the forefront there? Because say China is the champion. China speaks for the people. China speaks for those who have been colonized and says, we've been colonized too, and we understand it, and we're here to pave a new path. But then how much of that path, as it was kind of absorbed in the first Bandung, how much of that was actually solidarity with Africans, and how much of it was, lending itself to this Black internationalism that we talk about?
yeah, that's a really, really great question. So I would say it's kind of it's an interesting question, and it depends from where you're approaching it. So on one level, at least in the United States, so Black internationalism can be understood, on one end as a kind of U.S. oriented phenomenon of Black militants and
Yeah,
revolutionaries who are attempting to plug into this world via a variety of different theoretical and political sort of ideas. And on the other hand, we have then the emergence of, say, in Africa, of these recently decolonized anti-colonial states. Perhaps the most famous, of course, is Kwame Nkrumah,
yeah,
the sort of Pan-Africanist model for how you are going to organize, overcome the sorts of crystallized tribal linguistic. Yes, exactly.
I'm reading it right now.
The
The
autobiography of
autobiography.
Kwame
Yeah,
Nkrumah. He
yeah.
his book
Public
on
narrative.
neocolonialism becomes a very popular read
Yeah.
during that era as well. And
Mm.
so many of people are looking to this model. The idea of pan sorts of solidarities are very popular in the 50s and 60s. So Nasser's model of pan-Arab nationalism is going to animate much of the Arab world. And so Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism is going to do much of the same. Now, he actually has some major difficulties and hurdles in the sense that European rule had helped crystallize and promote rigid sort of tribal differences and linguistic differences and all kinds of things that uh, are that outside external powers are able to exploit and manipulate in order to weaken a kind of shared consciousness, right? And so much of the thrust of Nkrumah was that, look, if we ever want to get out of the situation we find ourselves in, our resources being extracted, our people being exploited, our land being controlled, then the way we can do that is through this sort of Pan-Africanist narrative that allows us to overcome these differences that are used to divide and conquer. In that sense, the Chinese model proves very formative, right? Because much of the 50s in China is a nation building project across this massive landmass. And that incorporates places like Tibet, places like Xinjiang that have different ethnicities. Perhaps not as diverse, say, as parts of Africa where the tribal and other diversities are more widespread and varied, but that particular narrative story of how you build up a nation that is immune or at least very difficult to pick apart and divide and conquer becomes a very important model. What cannot happen if you want to win your liberation is be divided and conquered by a series of separatist movements. Now,
Mm.
this is, by the way, the famous, most important tool of imperial policymakers worldwide. So, in Indonesia faces this problem, right? It's thousands of islands, some very big, some very tiny, and they have to have this sort of unifying national project. This is the creation, for instance, of Bahasa Indonesia, this lingua franca of Indonesia, where you have one sort of spoken and
Right.
written sort of word that can connect everybody, and then everybody's various regional dialects, etc. But that sort of unifying linguistic apparatus is important. The sort of shared identity becomes important. And what does the U.S. do? Well, it arms separatist rebels. In fact, there's a very famous incident called the Ellen Pope Affair of
Yeah.
1958, where a CIA fighter is shot down by by the Indonesian armed forces. They capture this guy. He admits it. And yeah, the CIA was actually helping these rebels in these bombing campaigns to bomb Indonesia to try and pull themselves off. We see this in the Congo with Patrice Lumumba.
Mhm.
The mechanism through which Patrice Lumumba, the first independent leader of the Congo, when Congo wins independence from the Belgians, is something called the Katanga crisis. It's this very resource-rich region that is propped up, and in fact, not just by the United States and the Belgians, but also by the UN. The UN has a very nefarious, duplicitous role in
Mm.
propping up these Katangan rebels. And this Katanga crisis becomes the crisis through which Lumumba is eventually captured and executed, and the first independent leader of Congo is done away with. One of his crimes was that he was willing to talk to the Soviets for aid, and so this is the model, right? And so in that sense, the Chinese model is in some ways very important and inspiring. It's this sort of unified place that can collectively is immune to the kind of separatists, or if not immune, it's able to deal with these sort of the breaking up of its sovereignty across this large geographic space. And so that model becomes very important alongside the anti-imperialist rhetoric, which is we have this history of colonial domination, this century of humiliation that China has
Yeah.
experienced, the Opium Wars. Africa had gone through the Berlin Conference of 1884, the carving up of Africa into these states that are literally drawn up at a table at a conference in Germany. And so this becomes, those shared histories become very important. And China then has a successful revolution that unifies the country, has a variety of nation-building exercises throughout the 1950s, across a massive geographic landmass with a massive, immense amount of people. And so this becomes a very important model, and people take very seriously what China is saying and what it's thinking, and the way it's thinking about how you move forward with liberation for yourself and for your neighbors. And so this becomes very important because in the 50s, China is a little bit more slow and cautious as the national unity project is being built domestically. Their outward approach is a little bit more cautious. It's diplomatic. It's the Zhao Enlai of Bandung. He's able to work with the sort of right-wing governments and left-wing governments and sort of nationalist governments who are sort of hovering in between. He's able to really navigate those well. By the 60s, however, with the Sino-Soviet split has really ruptured by the early 60s. So both the Chinese and the Soviets are in a increasingly antagonistic relationship, and the Chinese are in an increasingly antagonistic relationship with the United States. So they're really being antagonized by both of the major powers. And they've also had now a border war with India, right? The other sort of big center of non-alignment in the world, in the early 60s. China is increasingly looking for allies and allegiances. And so what it does is it builds up what is called, in the sort of early to mid 1960s, this thing called the Beijing-Jakarta axis. And so Indonesia and China become the heads of this regional bloc of powers that includes Cambodia, the DPRK, North Korea, North Vietnam, and actually Pakistan as well. And so this Beijing-Jakarta axis, which is centered on this relationship between China and Indonesia, in 1963 really becomes the big threat to Western powers in the region, and becomes a regional model for how you can, say, overcome some of those linguistic and ethnic differences, etc., in a sort of political alliance. And so in 1963, the Beijing-Jakarta axis is really solidified, and it begins to grow. And out of that project comes this new era of the Bandung, the spirit of Bandung, this project that Sukarno comes up with called CONEFO, the Conference of the New Emerging Forces. China is a big proponent of this and ends up actually financially backing it. And so in Indonesia, the Chinese will spend quite a lot of money. I'd have to go back to my footnotes to check the amount of millions of dollars they spend, but it's a good amount at the time. And they help the Indonesians build up this apparatus for this conference called the Conference of the New Emerging Forces. We might think this is just another solidarity conference or some kind of non-alignment, but what they were arguing at the time, and what the CIA and the State Department and the embassy in Jakarta was really worried about, is that they're talking about this being a new United Nations, a United Nations that represents everyone who is excluded from the current UN, or who is upset with the way in which the UN is dominated by the Western powers. And so at the time, that includes China, it includes all of the states I had previously mentioned, North Vietnam, North Korea, of course the Palestinians are part of this, they're excluded from the UN. And so it would have been about 30% of the world's population entering this new international apparatus. Indonesia had just withdrawn from the UN in January of 1965, and they said, look, we're going to build this new thing. We're building our own UN. We're building the facilities for it. And it had the potential, it had the threat of developing dual power on the international level, institutional dual power. And so that's the story that I try to tell. And the PRC, China becomes an integral part of that, both in its rhetoric, but also it's putting its money where its mouth is. It's funding, it's sending teams of engineers, it's doing all of these things to build this project up, and attempting to also get African nations and Arab nations involved in it. So it hopes to pull Nasser away from the non-aligned movement. It hopes to pull Kwame Nkrumah in. It hopes to get Algeria on board. In fact, it's hoping to use the second Bandung conference, scheduled for the summer of 1965, as a springboard to CONEFO, right, in 66. This is the idea. It's the big project. I imagine you've probably never heard of CONEFO, or your audience probably has never heard of CONEFO, and there's a reason for it. And
That's what I wanted to interrupt you for just a quick second. Okay, there's the spirit of anti-colonialism, and everybody, or the independent kind of leaders in specific key regions, have their own understanding. Kwame Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism, and this nonviolence, a little bit more of a revolutionary approach from China, and they have this power, and there's a spirit to that power. But then how does that spirit get crushed? And then if you have 30% of the world that is seemingly telling the same story about themselves, and the bad guy is the bad guy, and it's consistent, where's this coalition, and then how is it dismantled?
Yeah, so that's really interesting that you asked that question, because I think it's a very useful question. Of course, in 1956, Mao declares quite famously that imperialism is a paper tiger. I think we all probably know this phrase, right? That imperialism is a paper tiger that is looks scary. You know, you cast a shadow on a paper tiger, and it looks very scary. That light. But really, it is just a paper tiger, and it might have some teeth and some claws. But Mao's sort of antidote for that is you have to knock it out piecemeal. So you punch one tooth and it knocks it out, and you punch the next one and you knock it out piece by piece, and then once all the teeth are gone, you can deal with the claws. And that's how you'll dismantle imperialism. And this is Mao's theory. It becomes very popular. You have people are reciting many of the idioms of Mao. The 1968 generation becomes enamored with the little red book, etc. And so this becomes the way that people start thinking about this. But what happens, in fact, is really actually the reverse, is that imperialism is quite strong. And in fact, it's even more capable than, say, the PRC of what we might call piecemeal imperialism, which is knocking out the teeth of this rising, say, if not
Yeah.
tiger, then this rising dragon that is the
Yeah.
PRC in China and the Eastern world, right? And so what they're able to do is through these kinds of piecemeal attacks, they are able to weaken and enervate and degrade and then eventually dismantle this Beijing-Jakarta axis. So the biggest blow happens in 1965. And it's here in the West, we think of 1968 as the sort of revolutionary year, right? It's the height of the Black Panther Party. It's the height of, say, the May strikes in France that sort of cripple France. Italy's on fire. There's all this sort of revolutionary spirit across the world. And in the West, it's a time of upheaval and kind of rethinking of society and structures that exist. But 1965 in much of the global South is this very disastrous year, particularly centered on the events in Indonesia. So the U.S. Supports a right-wing military general named General Suharto. He leads a coup in Indonesia. And I don't want to bore you or your audience with the story if
No,
you
no,
already know
no.
it, but
Please, yeah.
this U.S. backed general leads a coup, ousting Sukarno, the president of Indonesia. He eradicates the Indonesian Communist Party, which is the third largest communist party in the world. It is the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China, and the largest communist party of any non-communist state. Okay, so this is a tremendously important party. No one talks about it or thinks about it much, but the PKI is tremendously important. It is also one of the major mediators, one of the major sort of it's closer with Mao and the PRC. The leader, a guy named Derek Ide, is looking to sort of the Chinese model and Mao as the sort of probably the real inheritor of the kind of world revolution at the moment. But they're actually working with the Soviets as well, and so they're navigating between these two worlds, and so if anyone is going to be a mediator in the Sino-Soviet split, it's very likely this PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, as the third largest communist party in the world. That party is totally eradicated. 1 million Indonesian leftists, trade unionists, women's leaders are wiped out. They're killed. About 1 million more are thrown in prison. An entire generation of militants and revolutionaries is eradicated in the span of a few months. And it's one of the major political genocides of the 20th century, backed by the United States, that we don't ever talk about and we don't think about.
Yeah.
The other thing that it does is it totally crushes this CONEFO project, this alternative United Nations, because now all of
Mm.
a sudden Indonesia pivots towards the West. It becomes a sort of Western satrapy, a bridgehead in Southeast Asia into the rest of Asia, and then it also isolates China. China has now lost its closest ally. In fact, we
Mm.
call it the Beijing-Jakarta axis because it was Beijing and then Jakarta was the
Jakarta.
second largest partner. Now that
Mhm.
axis is ruptured. There's no clear path forward internationally. China's big allies that are left, are like Cambodia and North Korea and Albania.
Yeah.
States that are admirable perhaps, but they're not. They don't have the kind of size and weight and centers of gravity that a place like Indonesia does,
Yeah.
or the resources. And so it's China becomes isolated, and this is the end of 1965. And then what happens in China in 1966? March of 1966 is the beginning of the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, China is isolated on the international scene. It retreats into this domestic series of contestations at home, uh, and the Cultural Revolution, to some activists in the West, looks very like generative and creative and exciting. And there's students who are protesting and pulling their professors out of school and this and that. But it's really on the global level, it's disrupting a lot of those diplomatic lines of communication with even with many of China's allies. So, for instance, if you read Prince Norodom Sihanouk's book, his memoirs, he was the leader of Cambodia. He's ousted in a coup in 1970. But if you read his memoirs, he has a book called My War with the CIA. He talks very openly about the Cultural Revolution really challenging Cambodian-Chinese relations, because all of a sudden everyone is suspect. Now that Sukarno was overthrown, the lesson from that was, don't trust these progressive bourgeois leaders, even if they seem nice, if they're friends with us, you can't trust them. So all of a sudden now Sihanouk is under, the Chinese are suspicious of Sihanouk. Sukarno was ousted so easily. This was a bad model to do. Don't trust these leaders. And it cuts off many of the communications and diplomatic lines that had existed, further isolating China. And then the PRC then, as all of that is happening, the U.S. is doing its best to really heightened antagonism between the Soviets and the Chinese, and that culminates in the Sino-Soviet border conflict of 1969, an actual military conflict between the two largest communist powers in the world. In that sense, the Cultural Revolution becomes really disastrous for China internationally, and that's how we end up with then rapprochement with the United States in 1971. Kissinger comes over to meet Zhou Enlai secretly, and then publicly in 1972, Mao comes over to shake hands, and Nixon comes over to shake hands with Mao, and we get this drawing down of this kind of revolutionary spirit and revolutionary moment. That has its effects, and I'll perhaps save this later for one of your questions. I think it's in there later, but that has its effect on Black Power, on the Palestinian Revolution. That lifeline is now kind of cut, and many of those emerging national liberation movements who are really dependent upon having China as a center of gravity have kind of had their legs kicked out from under them. And so that's where people find themselves in 1972, 73.
It's almost as if when you're talking about this stuff, the Black liberation movement within the belly of the beast in the Americas is a few years late. And it seems as if they're referencing things that have happened, and they're trying to revive something that isn't there anymore. Is that what you would say?
This is my thesis, and by the way, this might be a contested thesis, because it's if I start making the argument, which I'm doing, that the U.S. really laid the groundwork for winning the Cold War in 1965, it's going to be, I'm sure some people would take issue with that, right? Because things come after. The Vietnamese defeat the United States in the 70s. African movements win liberation from Portugal in Mozambique and Angola, etc., in 74. And so there's moments of revolutionary sort of momentum that exists in the 70s. But in terms of, say, when we think of grand strategy, the U.S. had really laid the groundwork in 65. And you're precisely the point you picked up on. There is a lag time. The Western left in, say, the belly of the beast, or as they used to say, Babylon back in the day, inside Babylon. There's a lag time where that's not entirely clear to them, or even to some, of their alliances overseas, who don't really fully see which way the winds have blown after 65. And there's this period of what looks like generative, creative, revolutionary energy, like via the Cultural Revolution, The Palestinian Revolution emerges right at 1965. The Palestinian armed struggle is declared by Fatah in 65. The Black Panther Party emerges in 1966. So it's immediately as the door for world revolution is rapidly closing, these other movements,
Mm,
Black liberation, Black power, the Palestinian Revolution, are being birthed right at the moment where that door is shutting. And so that becomes the sort of I began my research by thinking by okay, the Black Panthers and the Palestinians have these shared
there's all happened.
imaginaries. They view China as this model and Vietnam as this model, and they have these shared imaginaries. But then I got into the research and into the histories, and I thought, man, these timelines are so similar. It's
Mm,
not just that they had a shared verbiage or an imagination, but the actual narrative, the timeline is very. I mean, when they start
yeah.
their zenith and then their slow denouement and then their final conclusion, it's almost. I mean, you can track them very closely. And I thought there has to be a reason for this. What's the reason? And so my answer, and we'll see if it withstands historical scrutiny, but my answer is that there's a structural reason, and that stems from this moment in 1965 where the international apparatus that could support them was destroyed.
Unbelievable and really exciting stuff. Cool theory. And I'm just drawing a lot of connections to myself now because like on a very basic level, um, if I were to look at propaganda, Chinese propaganda from the Cultural Revolution, it seems as if there's such friendly diplomacy between the Soviets and Chinese, and also friendly diplomacy between certain African nations. I see people like Africans reading the Little Red Book, for example, and I'm thinking as if it's all one and the same, and they're all inspired by each other, but then there's differing forces, and of course the world is challenging, and there's a lot of separatist movements in different parts. Um, but it's almost romantic to think of China as just saying something and then having that reverberated and be copied verbatim, and then young people think this, or governments want this. But really thinking about how it was dismantled kind of changes everything. And maybe if we can track back, or maybe localize on just the Black and Palestinian struggles, or Black and Palestinian solidarity now, now that they're kind of alone, or now that we see that what they thought was going to happen didn't happen, or just realizing that maybe all of their leaders, violent or not, systemically are getting rid of. Um, and where does that leave the Panthers years after? Where does that leave the Panthers or anybody else who wants this change where the figureheads are taken out and we then realize, okay, they were infiltrated the whole time. The right hand man's of CIA the whole time, or whatever, and then like how insidious is this? How where do they kind of come to grips with what their movement was, if it was anything at all? Because it could have just been a facade then at this point. I'm just spitballing.
No,
Mhm.
there's a lot of threads there, and I think a lot of really really fascinating ones. And I think there's it's interesting for me because, for instance, one of my early case studies that I deal with early in the book is Robert F. Williams, who enters into he enters into exile in 1960, early 1960. He first goes to Cuba, and then he realizes that perhaps within this growing Sino-Soviet split, the Chinese model is probably the one that is more revolutionary and more likely to kind of garner some victories for Black America and the U.S. But he's entering exile as a kind of individual, right? He's not really I mean, he was part of the NAACP, but he's not like the leading figure of the NAACP. He's just the Monroe County chapter in North Carolina leader. He doesn't really have a vanguard party, as was the term at the time, behind him, right? He's not. He doesn't have an army. He doesn't have anything. He's an individual who goes into exile and becomes propelled through first Cuba and then his relationship with Mao to this enormous stature that he builds in the mid 1960s. But back home, things are just starting to pick up once he's already in China, right? So you get the birth of the Black Panther Party, who Huey Newton declares Robert F. Williams a seminal inspiration for the party. His insistence on armed resistance to white racism was a tremendously important inspiration for the Panthers. But they're birthed in late '66, and then once the Panthers sort of multiply and spread to all these different chapters and all these different places all over the country, and it looks like for the first time the U.S. has what appears to be a serious kind of revolutionary party that is really worrying the authorities. I'm from Toledo, Ohio. One of in fact, to this day, I think the longest shootout in Toledo Police Department's history is with the local chapter of the Black Panther Party on the 1300 block of Dorr Street. And it's a story that no one talks about that I know of, but I dug it up. I dug up the archives, and I wrote a little piece about some of Toledo's more radical history.
Yeah.
Even in places you wouldn't think of. I mean, the Panthers were all over. So it was a serious organization, a serious party. And from about 66 to 1970, 71, the party is fundamentally internationalist in its approach, in its beliefs. It looks to every liberation struggle in Vietnam, in China, across Africa, the Palestinians. It is looking to every armed struggle as part and parcel of its own armed struggle. In fact, the Panthers had adopted something called the internal colony thesis. Your audience might be aware of it, but the thesis was essentially this idea that even though Black Americans exist in these sort of disparate and separated urban centers across the United States, they share a similar set of socioeconomic and political and sort of military conditions, in the sense that these police presences in urban centers often act like an occupying colonial force. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, Black America exists as a kind of internal colony inside the United States. Because of that, their natural alliance is with their fellow colonized brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, and their shared enemy is the United States and its various satrapies around the world. So that includes Israel, say, in the Middle East. Cool. So this is how you get some of these connections, right? And why Palestine and Israel become such a key touchstone within the Black Power movement. So this is the animating ethos of the era, and this becomes, in fact, most of the Panthers are kind of on board with this analysis. Even throughout the years that Huey Newton is imprisoned, he's imprisoned from '67 to September, I think, August or September 1970, and while he's in prison, Eldridge Cleaver becomes the kind of major internationalist figure who leads the Panthers, especially because he ends up in exile, and he ends up for a brief period in Cuba, much like Robert F. Williams, and then ends up in Algeria. And in Algeria, the Algerians give the Black Panthers an embassy out of which to operate. And so from this embassy in Algeria, the Panthers are meeting Palestinians, they're meeting the North Koreans, they're meeting the Chinese, they're meeting the Vietnamese. In fact, the villa that they are given used to be the North Vietnamese villa, and then the North Vietnamese were upgraded to a new building, and the Panthers inherit their old building. So it's this remarkable lineage, right? And of this sort of international moment, which still feels very revolutionary in, say, 1969, 1970. It's not clear at the time that it's absolutely certain that China is going to be engaging in rapprochement with the U.S. and attempting to win a seat at the United Nations, and this becomes the sort of guiding foreign policy principle of the PRC. But at the moment, it feels very revolutionary. But what we kind of dig out of the research is that even by the early 1970s, it feels as if things are starting to slow down, and people are starting to look in different directions. In fact, even China is starting to look in different directions. There's some evidence to suggest that the Chinese are encouraging the Panthers to, by sort of 1971, to really tame rhetoric. Yeah, to kind of simmer down. Like, in fact, your job, your duty as real kind of revolutionary, is the best thing you can do is really go back home, sort of reframe our image to American audiences, make China
Yeah.
more palatable to the U.S. And in fact, this is what you see. This is precisely what happens on the domestic side back home in the United States. Huey
Actually,
Newton. Go ahead.
oh no, sorry. I want you to continue, but I'm actually curious. Why did that happen? How did that go through? So you would present this opportunity to the Panthers to go back and simmer down, and then it just happens? Is that the case?
Well, I think the point that you made earlier about leaders being killed. I mean, we can't forget in the context of all of this is COINTELPRO. In the context of all of this domestically is uh, a campaign led by the FBI and other intelligence services to discredit, dismantle, destroy, weaken, assassinate, uh, and engage in all kinds of other nefarious acts against the Panthers to derail them and destroy them. Snitch jacketing, planting information on someone that makes them appear that they might be a snitch, and then having them be, attacked by other members of the Panthers who think that they've betrayed them, but really they didn't, and the
What did
person
it? Yeah.
accusing them of betraying them is the snitch. I mean, it's really, really. I mean, the sort of infiltration is very severe. Huey Newton was in prison for years and underwent in the California penal system, and very likely underwent all kinds of what was probably very nasty and horrific forms of psychological and perhaps physical torture. I mean, the California just had the state of California just had to apologize a couple years ago for injecting prisoners with chemical fertilizer in the 1970s or late 1960s. I mean, it was really, really nasty stuff. The kinds of things that they did were really horrific. Newton comes out of prison actually a very changed man, at least in his theoretical outlook. He gets out of jail in late 1970. He delivers a speech at Boston College declaring that the Black Panthers are no longer internationalists. In fact, they are intercommunalists, and I'm sure you've probably heard this theory, this idea of what he calls revolutionary intercommunalism. But in many ways, this idea is essentially that U.S. imperialism is so powerful that national sovereignty as such no longer exists. And as a result of that, national liberation struggles no longer make sense. And internationalism, this sort of solidarity in between these different anti-colonial national liberation struggles, is anachronistic. It's a thing of the past. And so what we need to do instead is focus on sort of community building. And this is actually what signals the retreat from the inside the Panthers, the retreat from armed struggle and guerrilla warfare. So in the Black Panther newspaper around 1970, late 1970, all of a sudden, those famous Emory Douglas drawings of the guns, stuck in the snouts of the pigs, and the pigs are the U.S. imperialists. Those all start to disappear, and the art becomes, a mother holding a child, and it's beautiful stuff, but it's not armed struggle stuff, right? And so that starts to go away, and then there's this shift towards the survival programs. And what Newton eventually comes up with is that we need to close down some of these more raucous chapters who are, engaging in shootouts. We need to solidify in Oakland. We can develop a base of operations in Oakland, and then maybe in 1973 we can win elections. We can run Bobby Seale for mayor.
Yeah.
We can try to win elections in Oakland, etc. He gets like maybe a third of the vote, 30%, something like that. But this becomes the model on the Newton side. All of a sudden, Eldridge Cleaver is over there in Algeria,
Hmm.
and he's still shopping around for revolution, internationalist revolution. He is on tour in North Korea. In fact, his daughter is born in North Korea. His wife Eldridge's wife Kathleen Cleaver gives birth to their daughter Joju in North Korea. Her name is granted to her by Madam Kim Il Sung. I mean, Eldridge Cleaver is looking at North Korea as a model. To a lesser extent, the Chinese, because it's clear at that point that China is maybe like a little bit more cautious and slow after the Sino-Soviet border war and all of this the sort of disruptions of the Cultural Revolution. But Eldridge is very inspired by North Korea in particular, but also Vietnam. he begins to develop this Asian model, this Asian strategy of liberation. And his idea is, if he can get all of these East Asian nations to support a North American liberation front, he can come back and start a guerrilla struggle in the United States. And he's very serious about it. He hopes he can do it. And he's really shut down by Newton, basically,
Mm.
who in fact, there's a very famous radio television program in February of 1971 where Newton calls Cleaver live on air, and they have this huge falling out. It's actually really fascinating
Oh,
documentary footage. I highly encourage you to look it up. I'll try to
I'll
send
go
it to
check it
you.
out. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I'll send you
That'd be
the link.
interesting.
But yeah, it's this very contentious moment. Newton expels the internationalist section in Algeria from the Black Panther Party, and all of a sudden Cleaver is really isolated, and he can't follow this policy anymore. And Newton has developed this new theory that is much less focused on armed struggle, and that also has all kinds of implications for how they engage with other movements around the world, including the Palestinians, but also China. China is going through its own kind of retreat from this really hardcore sort of militant phase during this period as well. So Newton preempts Nixon and goes to China. He hopes he's going to meet Mao. He doesn't meet Mao. He only meets Zhou Enlai. But Zhou Enlai basically tells him, look, it's time now to kind of rethink strategy. We need to get into the UN. Your duty should be to really start working on domestic audiences, reframe China's image. So Elaine Brown, I have her memoir here is useful in sort of this regard as well. A Taste
Cool.
of Power, it's called.
Interesting.
She cites the Chinese model as instructive for the Panthers in the 1970s. All of a sudden, they're interested in moving towards entrance into the
Wow.
United Nations, rapprochement with the U.S., and this becomes the model. The Panthers start focusing on um, uh, trying to get some kind of plebiscite from the United Nations. There's this emphasis on using it as a tool to kind of draw attention to the plight of Black America. And so that connection becomes very important, both in the Panthers' internationalist phase, where China is still, as a result of the Cultural Revolution, engaged in this kind of knowledge production and what we would say propaganda related to revolution and revolutionary movements, but also in that period thereafter, in the 70s, the Panthers are taking some of their cues as well from China. It becomes an instructive model for how do you sort of what they view as maybe growing up or maturing, and moving away from this kind of more dangerous stuff that you know was in many ways attacked and destroyed by the intelligence services and weakened in that regard. But there were still those significant elements willing to pursue it, and Cleaver becomes that model for a while in Algeria. But he fails to really he shops around and fails to really get the kind of buyers that he might need to engage in that project, especially once Newton has expelled him and sort of chopped the legs out from under him. So
It is a really interesting kind of sentiment to feel like, okay, they're everywhere. We don't know who to trust, and we're alone. Guess let's just figure it out. Let's go in and try to become as much as them as we can, and maybe then it will make sense. Now, which is a really interesting point, and I don't want to kind of chop this, but I want to go back to maybe a couple places earlier, and maybe more in a more creative way, just thinking about challenging colonial power struggles. I know that there's a very easy understanding of what happens and then how the wind is out of the sails for certain countries and how maybe some people might be looking at developing local capacity or communities. So thinking about that, um, how does, say, for something that movement in the Panther Party of looking at community programs, how does that really translate to what they had once thought was their brother in arms in Palestine? Those resistance movements, because they're changing, and their understanding of this challenge to colonial power or imperialistic power is no different. And I firstly wrote this question thinking that it was going to be one and the same, but now they're different. How did, how did that kind of deviate? And is there anything to say about that? Is there anything to learn about that today? Because there's still such a thing as the spirit of armed resistance, and there's still oppressive power out there.
Yeah. So okay. So if I understood the question correctly, I think it was the sort of tracing the Black liberation struggles connection to Palestine, and
Mhm,
then
mhm.
how those things maybe shift over time, and then what the lessons are for today. Is that kind of the?
Yeah, I think so. Because on the one hand, you have revolutionary thinkers that are kind of silenced or maybe just become amalgamated, which is what obviously imperialistic power wants. They want assimilation to some degree, even as it's not so. But then now, still, well, I don't want to say there's kind of like ideology that still exists that says armed resistance is what we need to do. And maybe it's just a function of their own circumstance. But I'm just curious if there's anything ideologically that matches, or was there a break at some point?
Yeah, and that's so. This is a very difficult question because it
Yeah.
requires exposition into two simultaneous developments on both, say, the Black Power front, or developments that occur in the U.S. After, say, the Black Power movement, and then also what happens with the Palestinian Revolution. So, in some ways, I think Newton's model becomes instructive in this regard. So, as Newton is withdrawing from armed struggle in the 70s, uh, the question of Palestine becomes a victim of that as well. All of a sudden, in fact, on that telephone call between Eldridge Cleaver and Newton,
Mm-hmm.
they hang up on air. Newton calls back Eldridge to berate him for daring to challenge him, on air on this radio television program, and Cleaver starts challenging Newton back, especially on this idea that Newton has recently embraced a two-state solution to the Palestine-Israel question. And this had never been the Panthers' position ever. It had always
Yeah.
been the Palestinians are engaged in a war of national liberation against a colonial imperialist outpost.
Mm.
And it's their right to liberate their homeland from this European settler colonial state. Guys like Donald Cox, the Field Marshal Donald Cox, had articulated this in the Panther newspaper. This was the going theory. So when Newton all of a sudden embraces this two-state solution, this is also indicative of that. Let's get accepted into the UN model. Let's win our. This becomes a political kind of haggling tool. And so Newton also, incidentally, has some pride in this position. There's a lot of stories of how he came to this. So David Horowitz claims that he helped write this position paper for Newton. You may know him. He used to be a kind of leftist who turned into a kind of right-wing
Yeah.
neocon. He claims that he helped Newton write this paper. Elaine Brown claims that Newton took this position really to upset Eldridge and to have him be isolated in Algeria, where it was clear that the Algerians would never accept this. There's other. Elaine Brown also says that Newton confided in him that his either father or grandfather was half Jewish or something like that, and so he felt affinity to Israel and all of this. And so there's all of this bizarre. I mean, all of these factors that are these variables that are melting into one another. That makes Newton this complex man that he is. He's an extraordinarily complex figure,
Mm.
but he it also becomes, I think, politically, Palestine becomes a victim of that, right? No longer is the way to liberation armed struggle against Israel. In fact, this is diversionary. If you really want to change your societies, you should, get rid of the Arab monarchies and have democracy and this and that. And this becomes the sort of position of Newton's wing of the Panthers. This solidifies in 1974, but it reflects a kind of shifting international dynamic, which is the Palestinian Revolution itself experiences a series of defeats. Launches in 1965 in earnest, and then in 1967, Israel attacks Egypt and Syria, totally destroys the Egyptian Air Force very quickly. This is called the Naksa in Arabic, the setback. This encourages Palestinian armed movements to and parties to proliferate. So then we get this sort of revolutionary momentum within Palestine. All of these Palestinian parties in the diaspora are now organizing. Then and then as a result of that, we have this moment in, say, 67 to 1970 where things are really things are really moving for the Palestinians. All of these parties have emerged. There's all of these sort of engagements with Israel via armed struggle, guerrilla struggle. It becomes this inspiring kind of moment in the Palestinian Revolution. In 1970, the Palestinians are defeated in a series of events called Black September in Jordan. This becomes one of the first major defeats for the Palestinian Revolution. They're forced out of Jordan and into Lebanon. I can't go through all the history there for the sake of time, but then in Lebanon, throughout the 70s, it's very clear that things are going to heat up there, and that breaks out into something we call the Lebanese Civil War. And finally, the Palestinians are defeated and pushed out of Lebanon. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is forced out in 1982. 1982 is the exact year that the Panthers closed their very last institution, which is the Liberation School, one of their liberation schools in Oakland. It's the very last one remaining, and that closes officially in 1982. And so that year is a bit symbolic for the sort of end of an era, really, right? Although by the mid 70s, both of these movements were really severely hampered and in dire straits, and so this becomes the kind of Newton's backtracking on this position partially is sort of political expediency. The other thing is that it's makes it hard to make domestic alliances. Which is what Newton is pivoting towards. He wants to win elections. He wants, Oakland to be a kind of base of operations. His famous statement on, say, the women and gays liberation movement, which happens right at this moment where he's distancing himself from armed struggle and the Palestinians and and say the North Korean model. This is an attempt, in many ways, to win domestic audiences, right? He's replacing these internationalist alliances with what he views as a domestic coalition that he can build, and so this becomes part of the shift, right? The shift from the internationalist to the domestic, and so in that sense, the Palestinians become a victim of kind of shedding these internationalist allegiances. Still, though. Within Black America, the Palestinian cause, Black America provides the most fertile ground for sympathies with the Palestinian struggle out of any population in the United States. Historically, that has been the case, at least since the 50s and 60s. That legacy goes back to, say, the Nation of Islam, the NOI, under Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and all of that. But fast forward many years, and that sentiment is still there. So in 2014, for instance, when Black Lives Matter, breaks out in Ferguson, Missouri, and the Operation Protective Edge is carried out in Gaza, those solidarities are sort of rebirthed. But they're rebirthed in a kind of different moment, right? They're rebirthed in a moment where there is no, say, center of world revolution. There's no revolutionary China. China is now developed economically. It's a powerhouse. It is slow and cautious and bureaucratic, and it's different. It's a different place. It's not the PRC of Mao's 1960s, right? It is a very different place. It is engaged in kind of these, positions itself as kind of the adult in the room in these various international squabbles, right? It's this, we have centuries of civilization. We're going to, do this properly, right? Very different from the days of Mao saying a revolution is not a dinner party. It can't be so refined and elegant as that. It's a very different scenario, and so. So the solidarities reflect that, right? In fact, Robin Kelly, the historian Robin Kelly, has a really great quote. I wish I had it pulled up to read it to you, but it says something, and I don't want to butcher it because he's a very erudite scholar and much much more linguistically inclined than I, but he makes the argument essentially that, look, in my formative years, meaning in his formative years, the Palestinian militants were viewed as, essentially our brothers in arms, as militants in the struggle. The solidarities that emerge today are predicated on not commonalities of resistance as much as commonalities of oppression, right? We're oppressed because of this series of institutional structures that repress and oppress us and exploit us, and the Palestinians are oppressed, and as a result of that, we have to appeal on the grounds of our oppression to, say, the international community or to, these powers in order to, say, help us or make our situation better. And so the solidarities that emerge in the 2000s are different than the solidarities that emerge, say, in the era where armed struggle is the way that you liberate yourself, right? Where this becomes the sort of guiding principles for winning liberation. And so I think if I'm thinking about lessons for the present, my three big lessons would be, really quickly, we need these stories shared. We have to understand how these shared imaginaries were informed by shared infrastructures. Infrastructures sort of allow the groundwork for those imaginaries to form, and those have to be there. And if they're not there, those imaginaries are going to become limited. They're going to become oriented in a different way. The possibilities are going to look much smaller than they did, say, in the 1960s if the structures and the infrastructure is not there to support them. So knowing the history, I think, is very important. Many young people and many even old people, older activists, don't always know those histories fully, those sort of shared legacies, where they existed. The other thing we can't do would be approach these solidarities with glasses that are so rose-tinted that we can't see them as anything other than just beautiful and pristine and perfect. And what we have to do, I think, very seriously, is avoid what might be called the distortions of history that solidarities can produce, in the sense that we say, oh, the Black Panthers love Palestine, and that's it, and that's the story. But there's a lot more to that story. It's a story of the Panthers making some very strategic errors in Algeria. I mean, really bad things that they messed up on and made life hard there for the Algerians and for themselves. It's a story of, say, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine not really understanding the Black Power movement as an internal colony that is capable of waging guerrilla warfare. When they're looking at Black Power, they're reading it in a kind of civil rights way, right? They're reading it in a kind of it's there's injustice there, and but they're not viewing necessarily the PFLP, at least, and other factions, other parties of the Palestinian resistance are possibly different, but they're not always viewing them in that way. They're viewing them sometimes in a much more civil rights kind of reform-oriented manner. They support them, but it's not this revolutionary guerrilla anti-colonial struggle in the same way that, say, anti-colonial movements in Africa are viewed as anti-colonial movements proper. And so that's really important to understand, is that we also have to understand what was going on from the other direction, and we have to understand where my final point would be, we have to understand where internationalist solidarities emerge as a result also of regional and international blocs. Often these regional blocs are the ones providing the apparatus through which these solidarities can be produced. And so maintaining and defending those regional blocs becomes a core component of those kinds of international solidarities, even where sometimes they're not as perhaps radical or as forward-thinking as perhaps we'd like them to be. I do think it's very important to understand the role that regional blocs play, and how quickly those, when those are destroyed and dismantled and pieced apart, that those solidarities can be thrown away or at least degraded or destroyed with them. And I think we need to be really, really cognizant of that as we're thinking about the local level, which is very important, but thinking about how that plugs into bigger national and international questions as well.
That's really cool. Those 3 points are like we could talk about that for a long time. And I really hope you address that in the book because that'd be really great to hear you articulate it in a different way. But I completely agree. Um, and I am subject to this too. I look back at these propaganda courses from China, and I'm like, wow, they were so connected, and everybody was so into it, and they hated the British, and blah blah blah, and it's never that simple. I know that you're probably thinking about time right now, and I just want to have one last open-ended question, and this can be related to anything, but maybe also tied to the latter chapters of your book. I'm just curious how you see or what the thesis or what your research informs. Um, how do these movements in history, as they're interpreted today, present either hope or inform present day struggle against oppressive forces in the search of self-determination, in the search of sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and perhaps I preempted it a bit with those final 3 points that I was thinking about. But I would say that they present hope in the sense that what has come after has been worse. In the sense that the types of solidarities and the types of things that have come after have not been better, have not been more theoretically rigorous, have not been more intellectually rigorous, have not been more politically efficacious. So the retreat into, say, domestic orientations that's focused on, say, winning a seat here in Oakland or doing this, or we have to start thinking big again, and we have to start thinking boldly, and we have to start thinking I dare say, I hate to say the word utopian, but in the sense that we have to start having these big, bold imaginations once again. And that means, even for institutions that are emerging like BRICS, which is viewed as a kind of alternative to, say, Western-backed monetary and fiscal domination of the world, uh, as inspiring as that is, circumventing, say the SWIFT banking system that, the West totally dominates and being able to avoid sanctions, those are really important international apparatuses to build. At the same time, they've not stopped the genocide in Gaza. They've been totally incapable or maybe just politically unwilling to stop the genocide in Gaza because the cost might be high. And I think we need to think one of the reasons I became so inspired and wanted to study CONEFO is not just because it hasn't been talked about, but because I think that was a big, bold, and ambitious project that was looking at the future auspiciously and looking at it in a way that it was um, what they thought destined to move in that direction. It would be changed in that direction, and of course that didn't happen, but I think they had adopted one of the beautiful things that I do think we should draw precisely from those propaganda posters you're talking about is that they did provide shared imaginaries that were extraordinarily animating. What
Mm,
our goal today, I think, is depending on where we are, of course, because our role in the West is different than the people who are than those who are actually building up the institutions, say in the global South. But our role, at least in the West, would be to do our best to not do harm. In the sense that it's very easy for activists, as often people on the left call themselves now in the U.S., to do harm by say internalizing State Department propaganda about a place, and then engaging in a set of politics that help to undermine or kind of carry water for attempts at regime change that I don't think are particularly helpful or useful for us, attempting to build a new world, or for those places across the global South where that's the case. And I think I think we need to be very careful and cautious on those grounds, but we also need
Mhm.
to be bold and imaginary. And those shared solidarities from the era of the 1960s provide us a bit of illumination for how to think about these things in terms of armed struggle, in terms of shared imaginaries, in terms of internationalist sensibilities,
Mhm.
and in terms of what we could perhaps make real via the building of infrastructure that can sustain those things in the long haul, and not just for moments and flashpoints. And that's I think becomes the critical bridge, is bridging those shared imaginaries with the kind of international infrastructure that can support them. I think there's nothing clearer today than the genocide being waged in Gaza to show the total futility of something like the United Nations. I think CNEFO provides an alternative. I'm not sure that BRICS does fully, but
Mhm.
maybe it's a starting point, a springboard into something that we can help support and build and think about as we're moving forward.
That's really well said. And I had a question that kind of came to my mind as you were speaking, but now I think it's just kind of floated away. There's just so much to think about when it was when you said the UN is it does not have the capacity essentially to address something like this. And you know, we're told in the international community everybody has an equal seat. And of course, Malcolm X, I think he is famous for saying just because you're at the table doesn't mean you're going to eat or something. I'm paraphrasing, but it's just like you see people fighting for statehood, you see people fighting for sovereignty, and then you get there, if at all you do, if at all you get there, and it's just not what it's promised. And the mechanisms and the vetoing and the blatant lies about what is actually happening. Um, I'm just getting a little bit personal here. I'm just thinking there has to be another framework and there has to be something. And so I think that the book and what you're talking about here about the imaginary and separate coalitions and other blocks. Um, maybe it's not going to happen with BRICS, but I'm inspired under the I'm inspired that it could, and maybe there's something to learn from everything, and maybe there is something. There's wisdom in every decision, and it's just up to us to look back and to let that inform how we move forward. Oh, I'm remembering now. You were talking about, because I really, if you need to go, you can go, but you were talking about how certain activists in the West might hinder the progression of somebody else, and maybe we're fighting for freedoms for them, or we're saying we're fighting for freedoms for them. Um, our involvement detracts from what needs to be happening there, or maybe our involvement implicates a narrative that is harmful. I know right now, and I really don't want to get too political, but with the deportations happening in the States with the students that were protesting, there's a group of people that think that these kids are terrorists. And that's the language. And it's just, whether you want to believe it or not, the result of that is that there's two stories now and blatant rights violations. We just don't know. I kind of feel almost hopeless in thinking what kind of positive action. This is what Kwame Nkrumah was talking about when he's, really trying to put together a democratic process for the country. He's saying, what are the positive actions that we could take so that they don't just squash us? Because why would they squash something that isn't threatening? All right, well, I mean, let me cancel 10 seconds. That wasn't really well thought out, but you know what I'm saying. Last question. What are the positive actions then? Because we see the example of resistance, we see how it can get worse. Is there something that is addressed in the book that is of this kind of how do we take action and how can we make it sustainable and positive?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I don't have a good or clean or easy answer for it because,
Mhm.
of course, it is very clear that we're entering an era of ratcheted up attacks on First Amendment rights. Particularly, they're able to do this via the mechanism of ICE deportations. But even at the, say, university level, I mean, Ohio has just passed a SB1, they call it, where you have to publicly post your syllabus online. It has to be, basically, there's a right for them to see what you are teaching, and that there's strict controls on certain topics related even to foreign policy that can be taught in the classrooms in Ohio at the university level. It's very, I mean, it is deeply Orwellian. And these, by the way, are the people who proclaim that they were the greatest free speech advocates and free speech believers and all of this and that. And they're the ones signing these bills and, promoting them. And so it's a very bizarre and Orwellian kind of moment. I think on the domestic level, our duty is to defend those who are being attacked, of course. I think that's absolutely policy number one, because whether individually you are totally aligned with someone or not, they'll come after you next is of course the lesson from history. And so it's very important to be able to defend those who are being attacked in one way or another. Especially on grounds of political divergence. I mean, this is something that I think is not even debatable. They're deserving of defense, and that becomes very important. When I was thinking of questions of doing no harm as best as possible, what I meant by that was, I lived through my sort of formative political experience was through what was now perhaps euphemistically called the Arab Spring. And much of the activism, even within circles of, say, the Palestine Solidarity Movement inside the U.S., was really, I would say, hampered, and I would say infiltrated by those who were highly dependent upon narratives supporting regime change in places like Syria. And whether or not, I mean, I have very severe criticisms of, say, the Assad government over its 50 years in power, particularly including Hafez al-Assad, the father who came to power in a way that, in my mind, betrayed the Palestinian revolution during the events of Black September. But that doesn't mean that in the United States, my duty is to help spread propaganda for things like Operation Timber Sycamore, which was the CIA plan to arm rebels to overthrow the Syrian government, instituted under Barack Obama. And that's not my job in the Western, as part of the left in the belly of the beast, or of this movement in the imperial core. My duty and my job is to, as best as possible, to do no harm. And that means not engaging in the kinds of, I can't be carrying water, and I don't think other people should either, for those kinds of regime change operations. We saw that in 2011 with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And whatever one thinks of Muammar Gaddafi, in the 80s and 90s, when other people wouldn't, he provided a lifeline to black militants. There's a very beautiful picture of Robert F. Williams sitting at a meeting of American revolutionaries in Libya, learning from Muammar Gaddafi. This is in the 80s. His heyday of political activism is gone, and he ends up in Libya. He's sitting on a stool, and Gaddafi's there giving this lecture in this small room. I mean, he's 10 feet from him, and Gaddafi provides a lifeline to the IRA in Ireland, to people that say, that Mao wouldn't, or the Chinese at that time wouldn't touch, you know what I mean? In say the mid 70s, Gaddafi becomes very important. And here the narrative was, of course, he is a brutal dictator and needed to be ousted. And that led to a NATO bombing of Libya, a NATO regime change operation. And much of the Western left supported that. And whether or not you like the guy, our job here should not be to do regime change operations and to carry water for them. And I think that's just a very basic point of principle that we in solidarity movements need to think about, because it also means that we lose the kind of physical spaces that allows our movements to operate, that allows our movements to seek refuge, that allows our movements to have places to go to when things get hairy here. And so I think there's a reciprocal responsibility, of course, but I also think that we haven't held up our end of the bargain, at least in the past 30 or 40 years. And I think maybe we should rethink how we're engaging in some of these questions moving forward.
And I guess that really touches upon all levels of discourse, whether we're just talking at me or at the intergovernmental level, where you're talking about the real cause and effect of interference, which I think is a great place to end. Um, just once we talk about interference in American grabs and other places, what Trump is doing as of yesterday, man, crazy times, but not so relevant to what we just talked about. But anyhow,
They won't be boring times, that's for
no, it
sure.
won't be boring times.
What 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 is Mao's famous line? There's chaos under the heavens. The situation is excellent.
We really appreciate you bringing all these antidotes. There's just such a wealth of information here, and I was completely unexpecting it, and I love where the conversation's gone. Usually it doesn't go this far. Um, so, uh, yes, well, thank you so much for coming, and please let me know about your book, and let me know if I could um, help plug the book anywhere or help promote it in any way, because obviously I would like to read it. These things are just so exciting for me, thinking about the historical connection and some of the things you even mentioned today about, because I'm just almost looking at things right now, just right now, and I'm thinking, why is the world as it is? Um, and it takes a lot of effort to look 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years back, but it's necessary. And I'm really glad that you've helped with that perspective today. So thank you so much, and I really hope that we can stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope it's been useful for the audience too. So thanks so much.